In the winter of 1884, as the rest of the world went about its business, entirely unaware of what was being decided, 14 men sat down in Berlin, spread a map of Africa across a table, and divided an entire continent between themselves. No African was in the room, not one voice speaking for the hundreds of millions of people whose futures were being decided. Not one person who had actually walked the land, crossed the rivers, or understood the kingdoms and cultures that had existed across that continent for thousands of years. They divided it the way you might divide a pizza, arguing loudly about who was getting a fair share, drawing lines wherever the argument settled, and moving on to the next piece before anyone had properly looked at the last one. Just 14 men, a map, a ruler, a pencil, and the unshakable conviction that what they were doing was not just acceptable, but necessary. That word is important because the men in that room did not see themselves as thieves. They saw themselves as statesmen, managing an inevitable historical process, the expansion of European civilization into a world they believed was waiting to receive it. The partition of Africa was not a crime in their telling. It was an obligation, the responsibility of the advanced to uplift the primitive, of the civilized to rescue the savage. That was the story they told themselves. That was the story they told the world. What the Europeans saw when they looked at Africa was darkness, emptiness, a vast, ungoverned wilderness populated by peoples they considered pre-civilizational, tribes without states, cultures without history. The mainstream intellectual consensus of the era, supported by the most respected scientists and philosophers of the 19th century, placed European civilization at the apex of human development, and African societies somewhere near the base. And it was almost entirely wrong. The Mali Empire, at its 14th century peak, was one of the wealthiest civilizations on Earth. Its ruler, Mansa Musa, is by most serious estimates the wealthiest individual who has ever lived. When he made his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he brought 60,000 people and so much gold that he caused inflation across North Africa and the Middle East for over a decade. No European monarch of his era came close. The Kingdom of Congo had been sending ambassadors to Lisbon and maintaining diplomatic correspondence with European monarchs since the 15th century. The Ashanti Empire had a military capacity so formidable that it took the British 4 separate wars across 80 years to dismantle it. The Ethiopian Empire had been a continuous political entity for over 1,000 years. These were not primitive societies. They were complex, deeply developed civilizations with their own trajectories and their own futures. Futures that required no European intervention to continue flourishing. But here is the truth the civilizing mission always worked to obscure. The necessity the Europeans constructed was not primarily moral, it was material. Underneath the African interior lay resources on a staggering scale. Gold and diamonds in South Africa, rubber in the Congo, copper in what is now Zambia. The most valuable real estate on Earth had become accessible, and the question of who got which piece was not going to be left to the Africans who already lived there. Bismarck convened the Berlin Conference not out of any concern for Africa. The scramble had become dangerously uncoordinated. European armies were at genuine risk of stumbling into each other in the African interior. The concern was not what was happening to Africans. The concern was what competing European greed might do to Europe itself. Leopold II of Belgium requires particular attention. He had spent years constructing an image of humanitarian commitment, funding exploration, giving speeches about ending the Arab slave trade, presenting himself as Africa's philanthropic steward. He was so convincing that the Americans recognized his personal territorial claims over the Congo Basin before the conference had even convened. What he actually wanted was the Congo Basin, 2.5 million square kilometers of the most resource-rich land on Earth, as his own personal property. Not Belgium's colony, his, personally owned for his personal enrichment. The Berlin Conference gave it to him. By 1914, European powers controlled approximately 90% of the African continent, from 10% in 1880 to 90% in 30 years. And the borders drawn during that process had almost nothing to do with the civilizing mission the Europeans claimed to be pursuing. The border between Egypt and Sudan is a perfectly straight line, drawn straight because the people drawing it had no knowledge of what existed along it. That straight line created the Halib Triangle, territory disputed between Egypt and Sudan to this day. The border between Kenya and Tanzania deviates specifically to place Mount Kilimanjaro inside German East Africa, because Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted the tallest mountain in Africa and reached across the table to claim it. The Caprivi Strip in Namibia, a bizarre, narrow finger of territory jutting hundreds of kilometers into southern Africa, exists because a German official wanted theoretical river access that nobody had verified was even navigable. It was not. Scholars estimate the colonial borders divided approximately 170 distinct ethnic groups across international boundaries. The Somali people, one ethnic and linguistic group, were divided across 5 separate colonial territories. One people, 5 administrations, 5 legal systems, 5 foreign languages of governance. Not because it reflected Somali reality, because 5 colonial powers wanted 5 pieces of coastline. And the reverse, equally destructive. The Hausa Fulani, the Yoruba, and the Igbo, 3 distinct civilizations with different religions, different languages, and centuries of hostile relationships were pressed together into Nigeria, because it was administratively convenient for the British to manage one territory rather than 3. Leopold's Congo Free State was not a colony. It was a private extraction enterprise owned personally by one man, with 20 million people as its captive workforce. Congolese men, women, and children were assigned rubber harvest quotas. Failure meant mutilation. Hands were severed and presented in baskets as proof of enforcement. Villages that resisted were burned. The population of the Congo Basin declined by between 40 and 50% during Leopold's control. Estimates of the total death toll range from 1 to 10 million people. Nobody was counting the deaths. Leopold was counting the rubber. He died in 1909, wealthy, decorated, never tried. The DRC today contains more than 100 active armed groups, over 7 million internally displaced people, an estimated 6 million dead since the late 1990s. The country holds 70% of the world's coltan and roughly half its cobalt, the minerals in every smartphone and electric vehicle battery. Its GDP per capita is approximately $650. The resources leave, the people remain poor. The conflict continues. Nigeria. The Civil War of 1967 to 1970 killed between 1 and 3 million people. Approximately 98 million Nigerians live below the poverty line today, a country that was never designed to be viable, only manageable. Sudan and South Sudan. 2 civil wars, 50 years, 2.5 million dead. A 2011 referendum producing independence followed within 2 years by another civil war, 400,000 more dead, and 60% of the population facing acute food insecurity. Africa contains 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land, approximately 30% of global mineral reserves. By 2050, 1 in 4 human beings on Earth will be African. Africa accounts for approximately 3% of global GDP. 33 of the world's 46 least developed countries are African. The continent loses an estimated $88 billion annually through illicit financial flows. Every year, more leaves than enters. That is the legacy of the necessity. That is what the civilizing mission civilized. The pen lifted from the map in February 1885. The men shook hands. They went home. They called it a diplomatic achievement. The people whose continent had been divided among strangers in an afternoon, who had not been asked, not been informed, not been considered, were left with the lines. The lines are still there. The wars they caused are still being fought. The poverty they entrenched is still being measured. The instability they made inevitable is still being managed, badly, expensively, and without any serious reckoning with where it came from. The Europeans called it necessary. They built entire intellectual and moral architectures to sustain that claim. What they never did, what they were never willing to do, was ask the people whose continent it was whether they agreed, because they already knew the answer, and they had already decided it did not matter. They never paid for a single slice.